Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our Perspectives Asia seminar this evening, The Future of Chinese Leadership in the Global Economy. My name's Zara Stanhope and I'm the Curatorial Manager of Asian and Pacific Art here at the Queensland Art Gallery, Gallery of Modern Art. And I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we gather, the Kerbal and Jagera people, and also pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging in terms of their shared creative culture that we're all joining in this site. Welcome to GOMA and to tonight's event. I'd like to firstly acknowledge some special guests that we have here. Keiko Yanni, our Consul General of Japan in Brisbane, Casper Kuiper, Honorary Consul of the Netherlands in Brisbane, and Derek Brown, the State Officer Director of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And welcome to all of you as well. And I'd just also like to note a thank you to the students from the Conservatorium of Griffith University who were performing outside for us this evening. Tonight's lecture is part of an ongoing and enduring Perspectives Asia partnership between the Gallery's Australian Centre for Asia Pacific Art and Griffith University Griffith Asia Institute. The partnership with Griffith speaks to the engagement of that university with Asia and to the Gallery's vision to be the leading institution for the contemporary art of Asia, Australia and the Pacific. You can't talk about contemporary art of Asia without acknowledging the role played by artists in China in the late 20th and 21st centuries. Importantly, the avant-garde of Chinese art have been crucially engaged with social and political developments in that country since the late 1970s. And this gallery has been engaged with Chinese art and artists, particularly since our first Asia-Pacific triennial in 1993. And many of those artists' works have found their way into our collection and into exhibitions here and elsewhere. Tonight, it's my honour to introduce our special guest, Professor Cameron Thies, Director of the School of Politics and Global Studies at Arizona State University and President-elect International Studies Association. Many of you will know the Professor's research in the areas of state building in the developing world, interstate and civil conflict, international trade and international relations theory. He's published widely, books with academic publishers Routledge, Stanford and Michigan, and also in many journals, including the American Journal of Political Science, the Journal of Politics, the British Journal of Political Science, World Politics, International Studies Quarterly, and the European Journal of International Relations, to name just a few. The Professor's also been recognised with the Foreign Policy Analysis Distinguished Scholar Award in 2016. I think we're all cognizant of China's rising relative economic position and the leadership's determination to see their country will continue to rise financially and economically. With the growing base, China has also sought a more prominent role in global economic governance. Tonight, Professor Thies offers his reflections on the question of how we should think about the political and economic implications of Chinese aspirations. As part of what I think you see as a broader theoretical framework, the Professor will examine Chinese initiatives to provide additional global governance through investment initiatives, as well as discuss China's behaviour during a period of US withdrawal of leadership in key institutions governing the global economy. Please welcome Professor Thies.
Well, thank you for that very kind introduction. This is my first visit to Australia. I hope it's not my last after the talk. We'll see. Thank you very much to everyone involved in bringing me here to be part of this series. I'm quite honoured by that, and in particular Professor Kai He, who I've known for many years. It's quite a delight to be here with him. I was supposed to be here in January, as I've told a few of you, but we had a terrible flu season and I managed to catch the flu and miss a conference that Kai had organized, sort of on the theme of sort of Chinese global governance and sort of emerging challenges and these types of things. So what you're going to see tonight is a kind of reduced version of what that paper was supposed to be about. Of course, I am a professor, so I've crammed way too much information into this presentation. I apologize for that. Certainly there'll be time for questions and answers at the end. So thank you all for being here tonight. So as I mentioned, the talk today is going to focus primarily on China's roles in the economic sphere of international order, and that was sort of my task as part of this conference, although it's really impossible to separate the economic sphere of international order from security, of course. But we'll sort of start off by talking about how the two may connect, at least in people's minds or theoretically, then move to talk more about sort of international economic order itself and the role I think China may be playing, and then sort of revisit, in the end, the connection between economics and security. But the main takeaway I want to sort of start the talk with, and we'll end the talk with, is I think China continues to support the liberal international economic order that was founded at the end of World War II with the Bretton Woods institutions of the WTO, well, the GATT at that time, the WTO, IMF, and World Bank. And I don't see that changing anytime soon. Now we'll see how I got to that. And we'll see if you agree with me or what kinds of questions you may have. So first, why worry about China's economic power? So I think many people, it could be scholars, policymakers, pundits you see on TV, the average person often make the connection between economic and military power. Your own government's white paper issued last year spent quite a lot of time talking about changes in the Indo-Pacific with the rise of China economically and what that might mean security-wise and militarily for the region, as well as express concerns about what role the United States would continue to play in the region. Will the United States withdraw? What might that mean for Australia? What might that mean for the region? So many people, when they're thinking about the connections between economic and military power, draw on kind of intuitive or maybe more formalized theories. And I'll show you a few examples of formalized theories we have in political science to think about the connection between economic and military power. But it's, people draw on this connection almost intuitively, that economic growth, economic power will translate into military power and probably some kind of foreign policy revisionism that is more conflictual, right? So here's some examples from the political science scholarship. I'm not going to scare you too much with this or drag you too deep into the theory. But I think these kinds of things are what are behind a lot of this thinking. So this is an example of a theory called leadership long cycle theory, which is a way of thinking about the transition between global hegemons. So it posits that every 100 years or so, there is a dominant global hegemon. In order to transition from one hegemon to another, you need a global war to sort of start the cycle over again. So yes, this is frightening. So the proponents of this theory see this happening every 100 years. The current cycle is the American cycle that began as the British in this first quarter here, phase one, their power declined such that they were not able to themselves stave off a challenge from Germany for leadership of Europe. Instead, the United States rose to prominence. In this second era, I wish I had a pointer, but I don't, becomes the sort of dominant leader of the global economy, global security system, of course supported by other states that sort of agreed with its vision for the world. What's somewhat unique about the US's version of global hegemony is that it was institutionalized in a variety of international organizations. That was somewhat new in this sort of cycle. But over time, questions about US leadership arise, including within the United States itself. Its ability to lead in many areas declines. Its power relative to other states declines, in fact, quite rapidly over time since the end of World War II, and I'll show you that in a minute. Until perhaps we're in this phase 4, where we've achieved a position where the United States is no longer a hegemon, where it no longer maintains the balance of global power. Instead, many emerging challengers are out there rising up and potentially leading to the next cycle, a new global war. And will that be a global war involving China, right? So this is part of the thinking I think that people have in mind is a cyclical transition of sort of hegemonic systems, right? Here's one way of showing that with what's called a composite index of national capabilities. it's sort of a measure of sort of traditional military power, well, not just military power, but the kinds of things you think of as traditional power. It does include military expenditures as part of the index, population, steel production, energy production, these sorts of things. And you can see, if you look at these countries, some evidence of this cycle, right? The yellow line that starts on the side there is the United Kingdom, and you can see in the beginning of the 19th century, it held nearly 35% of the total capabilities in the world, but declined then fairly rapidly over time until you can see just before the turn of the 20th century, the United States overtook it in terms of its share of relative capabilities with that dark blue line. And you can see at points, reached about 35% of total capabilities in the world. But now if you continue over, after a sort of ill-fated challenge by Russia or Soviet Union during the Cold War, you see China's rise. And China, according to this measure, has already surpassed the United States in terms of traditional measures of power, right? You can also see it, here's another sort of version of this theory called power transition theory, which again is interested in these sort of long cycles of transitions between hegemonic orders. This one looks primarily at GDP, gross domestic product, which you can see in absolute terms on the left axis there. And then you can see the dates on the bottom axis. And of course, the interesting one to look at is the brown line that surpasses the blue line. And again, that is China in terms of GDP. Now, of course, there's controversies over how GDP is measured, but it's very clear that if China has not surpassed the United States in economic terms, it will fairly quickly, right? So what does it all mean, right? If our traditional theories in political science are correct, it's not good, right? It means that we are in a kind of transition period where we will be heading towards some kind of global war that might lead to the emergence of China as a new hegemon. And if so, the new hegemon, traditionally in these approaches, restructures the international order, right, to its liking, including the economic order. So this would mean if China would emerge as a hegemon, it would then restructure the economic system to fit its own priorities, its own domestic politics, its values, and its beliefs, which may or may not be consistent with the liberal international economic order set up by the United States and its allies at the conclusion of World War II, right? And some are already interpreting China's actions, such as the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the Belt and Road Initiative, as sort of the initial preparations for such a time when this transition will occur. Now, I'm going to disagree with this argument, right? So I presented you the doom and gloom to start with. I sort of would say be wary of these kinds of structural theories, I guess criticizing my own discipline for its reliance on these structural and rather deterministic theories, right? I mean, as you could see in those sort of cyclical theories, there's no real room for agency or decision-making there. It's just a product of where you are relative to other states in the international system, right? But I would suggest that China has benefited enormously from the liberal international economic order. They've benefited enormously from this system, right? Since opening up in the 1980s until the present time, they have emerged as a great power economically, right? Their interests lie within this current international economic order. Also, as I mentioned previously, unlike other hegemonic systems, this one, the American-led version, has been institutionalized in international organizations and regimes. So it's not like in previous, say, the previous hegemon, the United Kingdom, is usually given as the previous hegemon. It didn't have international organizations or international institutions that governed aspects of the global economy, right? But this system does, right? So it does have organizations like the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization, and the World Bank, which govern aspects of the international economic order so that the hegemon doesn't have to do it all by itself, right? It provides a system where states buy into the way the international order works, right? So what I see is China has definitely sought to increase its participation in this institutionalized economic order, which certainly reflects its growing economic clout and its desire for status and the recognition of that status, right? Which is something, there's a lot of research done in political science on sort of the need for status among states, particularly as they do emerge and grow in power over time. And simply that recognition actually often goes a long way to pacifying potential conflicts, right? And I would also suggest that any innovations that China is currently engaged in, and we'll talk about some of them, really largely serve unmet need from the existing international institutions, right? So I think they're largely augmenting what's currently happening already in the international system. And in reality, China is playing supporting roles, right, in the post-global financial crisis world. That's what I'm going to try to argue to you today, right? What those roles would look like? Well, we also can harken back to the Great Depression and Charles Kindleberger, who was an economist trying to explain why did the Great Depression last so long? And his argument was, well, the United Kingdom was exhausted as a hegemon and unable to play important roles in maintaining the global economy, and the United States at that time was not willing yet to pick up its mantle of global leadership, right? But Kindleberger says, no matter what, in any international system, we need somebody playing the role of stabilizer, playing the roles of providing open markets, serving as counter-cyclical lenders, maintaining stable exchange rates, coordinating macroeconomic policies, and serving as a lender of last resort. Now, Kindleberger thought we just needed one stabilizer, one hegemon, but what I'm suggesting is, and this isn't my argument in particular, but that in an institutionalized economic order like the one we have now, we don't need one state, one hegemon to play that role. We can cooperate. States can work together to provide these kinds of roles. So we can have multiple actors supporting the international economic order rather than a single dominant hegemon. But is there evidence that China is helping to play these supporting roles? And I think there is. So we'll just kind of walk through kind of the three main regimes in the international economic order, starting with global finance, and talk a little bit about some of China's actions, some of which are obviously up for interpretation. I'm giving you my particular interpretation. I recognize that other people may have different views, right? So in terms of global finance, I think we definitely see China playing a very supportive role, or set of roles here, right? In the aftermath of the global financial crisis, it was clear that the IMF was not adequately capitalized to deal with the stresses placed on the member states. They needed more money, right? And a number of the emerging powers were happy to provide that money, including China, in exchange for a larger voting share at the IMF, right? So, one thing to remember with all of these institutions is they are sort of frozen in time memories of the end of World War II, right? the constellation of power looks as it did at the end of the war when these institutions were set up, and there hadn't been a lot of change over time until recently, right, when China did manage to attain the third largest voting share in the organization after the US and Japan, thus contributing to the organization's sort of stabilizing roles as including lender of last resort. China also helped develop the contingency reserve arrangement for the BRICS organization. You're probably all familiar with the BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. It started off as sort of a label that an economist gave emerging markets and then turned into a full-fledged international organization over time when they became sort of self-aware, right? But they sort of created this sort of IMF-like function for themselves that China contributed to, in which they could also perform the lender of last resort and counter-cyclical lending roles for their members, right? And then the final example I'll give is the incorporation of the Chinese currency into the IMF basket of currencies that comprises its special drawing rights, which really puts it in sort of the the role of helping to maintain a stable exchange rate system for the world. In terms of global development, this is probably the area that China has received the most criticism, particularly from the United States, but many of the sort of China threat scholars in the United States and around the world are very suspicious about the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, right? So this was created in 2015 at China's behest, 57 original members, including Australia, including a number of states that had long been stalwart allies of the United States, and the United States under President Obama was dead set against the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, as you might remember, in part because, well, the Obama's sort of view was trying to sort of counter and contain China on every front, right? So the argument here was, well, we already have the Asian Development Bank, which is a regional development bank sort of under the World Bank auspices already. It's sort of guided by Japan and the United States, which dominate its sort of voting shares. So, I mean, the bank went through, obviously had a number of people joining up. The question is, you know, what role does this play? Many people see it as sort of kind of the initial foray into countering the World Bank. I don't really see it that way, in part because if you look at the kinds of projects, I put a little graphic I found the other day, it's not a lot of money right now, right? 2.5 billion. The president of the World Bank, actually at the time the AIB was formed, was actually in favor of it, saying there's something like $8 trillion of unmet infrastructure need in Asia. You know, this can't hurt, it can only help, right? The World Bank alone, the Asian Development Bank cannot produce that kind of financing alone. And in fact, almost all of these projects that are currently funded are funded in conjunction with the Asian Development Bank and the World Bank, right? So it's hard for me to see it as a real counter to the existing economic order, right? When it's working in partnership with it, and it's actually kind of a small amount of money right now. But we'll see what happens, right? More on global development, of course, the new development bank was part of the BRICS organization, $100 billion total capitalization. It has not made many loans so far. I was on their website sort of looking to see, there's not been much done so far, so it's hard to sort of assess what role this new development bank will play in terms of the global economic governance of development. The Belt and Road Initiative has attracted lots of attention, lots of conspiracy theories as well, right, about just what are the Chinese up to with the way they're financing this, with the way they're pressuring governments to be involved. I think that's still an open question. But it's hard to argue against building additional infrastructure that connects China with Europe, with Middle East, with the Indo-Pacific region, right? So in general, I still see China playing this sort of supportive role of providing regional development financing, sort of on balance across these different actions. Global trade is probably the most confusing and tricky part of things now. The US has sort of abandoned its traditional leadership in this area. Of course, you probably remember the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, that the United States under President Obama was championing again as a sort of way to counter China's regional comprehensive economic partnership. But then with the change in administration in the United States, President Trump said, nope, we're out. He had campaigned on it. I think part of the problem with the TPP was that nobody really understood what it was. It was done so non-transparently that almost no one really understood what it would fully mean. Even Hillary Clinton switched her position from when she was Secretary of State to when she was running for office, saying she would withdraw from it as well. But we're sort of left in the unusual sort of situation where China is really the only leader in terms of large-scale multilateral trade liberalization through the RCEP. And again, it's President Trump with the United States that has threatened a trade war with China. China has responded with threats in kind, and perhaps it appears maybe some actual action. It appears they've stopped buying U.S. soybeans, although this is just sort of people trying to figure out from the market who's doing what. And things are getting even more complicated. I don't know if you've seen the Chinese telecommunications sort of scandal that now looks like it involves an Indonesian property loan to a Trump-branded property. Look it up if you haven't seen it yet. So it's it leaves me wondering how trade policy is determined in the United States. I have no idea at this point. I'll just be honest, right? But we're in this sort of odd situation where China is actually defending the current trading system, right? They're the ones, providing in some sense open markets and defending the liberal trading order. So this one is going to be an interesting one to watch play out, I think. And it's probably one of the more important areas because, of course, trade between the United States and China is huge. Trade with China and everywhere is huge these days. So the decisions that are made there will be very consequential for Australia, for all of us. Right? So that's the sum of my argument. I think China is basically supporting the current liberal international economic order. Through its activities, it's helping to serve as a stabilizer of the global economy. It's helping to provide open markets, countercyclical lending, stable exchange rate, lender of last resort, providing regional development finance as well. I'm not arguing that China plays these roles perfectly, right? They do not. No state does. They've certainly been criticized on the open markets issue and exchange rates before. But I think in general, they are supporting the current system. I don't see evidence at this point that they intend to supplant or replace the liberal international economic order. Instead, I think they're going to provide additions to the current sort of global institutional structure that governs economic order in sort of a patchwork way, right? So maybe adding an Asian infrastructure investment bank, adding the new development bank. So they're adding pieces to an existing structure and trying to fit it in, right? But what about that connection to security? Because we can't forget about that piece, right? Certainly, China's behavior has become much more aggressive in defending their interests in the South China Sea. Australia knows that all too well with recent events. They continue to develop their blue water navy. In fact, I was reading an article in the Wall Street Journal today that people are warning that China's navy will overtake the United States' navy by 2030 unless U.S. procurement plans change dramatically. And of course, there's lots of talk about China securing basing rights and actually building bases outside of their home territory, which is unusual for China. It is usual for the hegemon, the United States, which has bases everywhere, right? But even Australia, I think there's been concerns about Vanuatu, I believe, is one of the places that they've suggested there may be a base. So we can't really rule out these kind of questions of security, even as I was thinking primarily about the global economy. I mean, it might be that supporting the liberal international economic order is an application of smart power, right? So they're using they're supporting the international institutions in one piece of the international order, even as perhaps they're using more hard power in the security order. So that's one way to potentially think about it, right? But does that necessarily mean that the gloom and doom of these sort of cyclical theories will come to pass and we'll end up fighting a global war with China? I don't think so. I think that connection between economic growth, military power, and sort of hegemonic dominance might be over. I think the international system is just too different now than it has been in the past. I mean, there's so many changes to talk about. We could talk about all night, and happy to talk more about that in Q&A if you like. I just think that the hegemonic system or cycles are over for now. I might be wrong, but I don't see another hegemonic successor to the United States. It's possible it could be the United States succeeding itself. I know a lot of people in the United States would be really happy if that happened. According to these theories, the United Kingdom have 2 centuries, so they got to do a second time. But otherwise, I see power being mostly sort of not concentrated in that way. Instead, you end up with some kind of multipolar system where countries really do have to work together to maintain these sort of the international order, right? So they have to work together through the IMF, through other institutions that have been established to maintain the international economic order. I don't think we're going to go backwards from that. Like, I don't think we're going to go back to the interwar years where there were high tariffs, trade wars. I don't think so. But again, it's hard to know for sure. I thought it was fitting to leave you with a quote attributed to Lao Tzu, the Chinese philosopher, about the dangers of prediction. I've been doing social science long enough to know to be careful about predicting the future. And there are so many variables at play now, it is hard to know what will happen. As I've mentioned with President Trump, it's hard to know from day to day what U.S. foreign policy is, right? On economic matters, on security matters. So those kind of variables we don't usually think about in our structural theorizing, right? But once in a while those get thrown in and throw us for a loop. So the main takeaway of the story is, I think for now, China will be playing supporting roles of the current global international economic order. I think the things that they are adding to it simply meet unmet need, right? We may not like all of the changes that they introduce. Maybe they wear away at some of the liberal norms, protections of workers' rights, these sorts of things. Maybe they're not as concerned about. But in general, I don't see them trying to overturn the economic aspect of global order at this point in time. So that's all I have for you, and I'm happy to take any kinds of questions you might have. Are you moderating, or do you me, or I don't know, it's whatever you want. Oh, yes, sir.
One of the ramifications of Belt and Road, of course, is that China's economic interests, company interests, and so on, are now spread throughout the globe, particularly in Africa, lots of places in Asia, and so on. Is that going to mean an increased Chinese presence, in a sense, more Djibouti bases and things such as this, do you think?
It's definitely possible. I mean, I think, the Chinese experience in Africa has been mixed, right? The reception that they receive when large numbers of Chinese folks move in and start running the factory, for example, has not been always positive. So I'm not sure how it will look like, but it would seem to be logical to expect a greater Chinese presence in these areas. In terms of military bases, that's the big unknown that I think we all would like to know more about. It is, I'm certain, very tempting for small countries to take the kind of money that would come with agreeing to basing rights. I mean, Djibouti is a good example of that. Vanuatu, if that is indeed going to happen, would be another good example. And China has played this game before. China and Taiwan play this game. In terms of trying to get small countries to recognize them as China, right? We'll build you an airport, we'll build you a stadium in exchange for recognition of us as China, right? So it's possible. Yes?
Thank you for your talk. I flew in from Vanuatu on Monday evening, and I can confirm, as has been said numerous occasions by our Prime Minister and our Foreign Minister, that there is no military base in Vanuatu, and neither is there any intention of being one. My question relates to China's use of its economic power as a donor, particularly in the Pacific Island region, and what your thoughts are as to the implications of the AIIB and whether it will provide grant financing rather than simply commercial finance, as is currently the case, and also what the implications are of the new aid agency.
So, I mean, one of the things I mentioned is, of course, we may not like the way China carries out its business, and I think that you're right about the way the AIIB does its financing now. It is through commercial loans. I don't know that that will change in the future. I have not seen any indications that it will. I'm sorry, what was the first part of your question?
Whether you see AIIB opening up a grant envelope and also what the implications are of the new aid
Could you tell me a little bit more about what the new aid agency? Because I'm. Oh,
That's pretty much all we know.
okay.
How that's going to fit within the political framework for how China operates.
I'm afraid I'm not familiar with enough with it to comment on that. Apologies. Yes.
Can I ask you about something that you haven't really mentioned? I'm sorry about that.
That's all right.
Even a bigger version of your paper. But the major geofinancial change which is occurring at the moment is the replacement of the US dollar as the sole reserve currency.
Right.
That is, almost every week there are new countries that are signing up to dealing in their own currencies and trade with China, who is their largest trading partner for just about every country in the world.
Mm.
The United States' hegemonic ability has owed no small part to being the sole reserve currency, thereby being able to defy economic logic, run a huge deficit, currently 21 trillion.
And growing by the second,
And growing.
thanks to our tax cut.
The replacement of the dollar is going to have dramatic effects, would you agree, on the United States' ability to use its hegemonic power, basically to bully smaller nations into doing things its way.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. I mean, it is one of the luxuries the United States has enjoyed since the end of the war, that it can defy economic logic, right? And there has not seemingly been any penalties to pay for that. I mean, there, of course, was, having to go off the gold standard when France, de Gaulle, I think, said, we're holding a huge amount of dollars here that we're about to put in for gold. And so, there have been attempts to temper the U.S. in the past, but it's seemingly, this shift is seemingly lost on U.S. policymakers, and I am unsure why that is the case. It's a function of our crippled political system, where the only real compromise seems to be, at the end of the day, well, let's just let everybody spend on everything that they want to spend on, and we'll finance it through debt, right? But that means we rely on China to buy our debt. And I remember reading I forget whose article it was, but they were interviewing people in the Fed's trading room, and they said that their biggest fear is the day they walk in and China isn't buying, right? Then what happens, right? When we're not recycling those dollars through our treasury bonds. So I think you're absolutely right. It is a huge shift. It is, I think, a movement toward this more deconcentrated kind of international system where, the trading will occur in multiple key currencies, and the dollar will be one of those. We'll see what happens to the United States. I mean, the United States has already defaulted on its debt at one point and didn't really pay a consequence for it. What will happen the next time? I don't know. But there will be, I can guarantee you there'll be a next time. We'll see. But it is evidence of this sort of long-term decline of the United States that a lot of people, I think, are shocked to hear about, including Americans. Don't quite understand that their relative position in the world has changed fairly dramatically since the end of World War II. Good question, though. Yeah. Yes?
Yes, my question relates to the concerns of the current Australian government in relation to Chinese influence, not only in the domestic policy, but also our universities, but in terms of investment in Australia by China. There's a lot of concern in the government about the attempted domination by state-owned enterprises in the development of our economic activity. Do you have a view on that?
Well, I understand the concern for sure, right? State-owned enterprises in China do not have to turn a profit, right? In the same way that an Australian firm might have to survive. So when they move in, they can invest heaps of money knowing that they don't need to make a return on that. So I understand that it's an area of concern. I don't know enough about the Australian situation to really. I can understand why it's a concern. I don't know the extent of the issue here. I mean, I know in other countries. I remember once I was in Iceland, and they basically, after a Chinese investor wanted to buy a significant amount of land, made it illegal for foreigners to own land. Now, I think that's a bit extreme, right? But there should be some way to temper, I think, the kind of influence that you're talking about, hopefully in a rather peaceful and negotiated way. I mean, Chinese investment can be helpful, right? But I think, as many of you are suggesting, it does also come with other things, right? But that's true of any kind of international investor, right? It's just that we often are more comfortable with some foreign investors than others. How about that? That's as diplomatic as I can be. Exactly. Yeah, all investors have interests, right? All donors have interests, right? I mean, but it's just some that we are more comfortable with their interests. Yeah. Yes, in the back.
Could you clarify or elaborate on? Sir, can you identify yourself when you ask a question? Thank you. John Donald, retired.
Good for you.
Thank you.
Or good on you, is that how we say it?
Thank you. Well done.
Yeah.
I'm curious about the matter of what you see as a multipolar world evolving, or hegemonies, more than one hegemony in a way. Because your first chart really talked about a unipolar world.
Mm-hmm.
So could you just elaborate on the conditions that you see that would make for that prediction of multipolar against what we would imagine historically as a unipolar world evolving?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the requirements of most of these theories that posit an emergence of a hegemon are things like they are typically global sea powers. So, China may be moving in that direction. They typically are liberal in nature, right? So the examples that are most often used are the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Netherlands previously as sort of relatively liberal in kind of the classical liberal sense. So China would not quite fit with that. They do, they're thought to usually contain the predominance of control of world trade, of the production of goods and services. So I just think many of those kinds of requirements of what we typically think of hegemons are not easily met in today's world. It's, even thinking about having a preponderance of military forces, the international system has evolved to a point where the conquest of other states is quite rare. It is an unusual event to have a new state be formed. Of course, there are counterexamples. We have Timor-Leste, just to the north. Russia certainly conquered Crimea, right? But those are rarities in today's world. In past hegemonic systems, conquering large chunks of the earth is sort of how the machines worked, right? British colonialism, before that Netherlands, before that Portugal, I think is a previous example of a hegemon. So I just don't see those things being feasible in today's world. And I don't know what kind of military one would need to really conquer the earth at this point. It's sort of mind-boggling to think about. I was thinking about that when I was watching the movie Dunkirk the other day, and I just thought, the whole, being just across the channel is, that's a few seconds on a jet plane today, right? Even sort of that whole process of global war, I think, would look very different, and maybe with there's a whole argument about what role nuclear weapons play in sort of preventing global war, but global war today would certainly be quite disastrous in a way that might not be recoverable, right? So I think maybe those are some of the things I think about. Would need to give it more structured thought, but I just don't think we see enough of those kinds of conditions being able to be met by any individual country today. So I think we get something more of a multipolar system, or maybe a bipolar system. I mean, we could be headed back into a kind of Cold War-like situation, perhaps the United States and China. I mean, it's hard to say at this point. Got two or three. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the talk. Very interesting. You believe Griffith University. I wanted to ask your opinion about the Chinese loans, the way they provide loans, specifically in Latin America. More about that. The way that they don't, that we know of, they don't make conditioning, like traditional way of the IMF. China is the first provider of loans now in Latin America. What do you think about that? Is that I agree with you that China is not trying to change this order, but this is kind of challenging, or do you see it just as another way of patching the current?
Well, I mean, the fact that someone's providing loans is a positive, right? But what you're suggesting is they're chipping away at some of the norms of our liberal international economic order. So they're not providing conditions. I mean, so in today's world, if you get money from the World Bank or the IMF, good governance is often a condition, right? Respect for workers' rights or human rights, those kinds of things are part of the deal. Now, how well those are often enforced probably varies, right? But at least there's kind of a semantic support for those norms. Whereas with China, you're right, there's no pretense, right? We're making you a loan, pay it back. Right? So does that undermine the current liberal order? I'm not sure, right? It doesn't necessarily support it, but I don't know that it fully undermines it. But perhaps this will depend on the extent and the amount of these loans over time. If they become more the norm, right, then that would undermine sort of what we think of as a liberal order. Yeah, that's a really good question.
Last question.
Michael Bowles, also retired. I'm just wondering if you're aware of an Australian book called Silent Invasion.
No.
It's about how they exert control without having to bother invading.
About how they exert control?
How to exert control without it. And I think one of the earlier speakers was probably had in mind. But though it's about Australia, you might find it interesting. Silent Invasion.
Silent Invasion.
Xenophobic rubbish.
Okay. Well, I mean, one of the things, one other way to think about hegemony is an exertion not of dominance, but of where people are led to believe that they support the same thing you support, right? So many people think about American hegemony as at least partly that other countries sort of ascribe to the same kind of values or have come to value the things that Americans value, the kinds of cultural products, that sort of thing. So there is, I think, always a sense in hegemony, there's kind of a double-edged thing, sort of a dominance aspect, but also a buying into or a seeing of something as legitimate, right? Which maybe relates to what you're talking about. Yeah. Is that it?
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Those are really good questions. I'm sorry my answers weren't better, but we'll just blame it on the jet lag.
My name is Kai He. I'm a professor of international relations at the Griffith Asia Institute. I'm supposed to help with the Q&A, but I know Cameron, as a professor, he wants to control the classroom. So I did not stand up, So thank you all, for coming. I hope you're enjoying the evening's talk. On behalf of GAI and the Queensland Art Gallery, Gallery of Modern Art, I would like to extend our gratitude to Professor Cameron Thies for his insightful and inspiring talk tonight. China is a big topic almost every day in Australia. So no one would deny that the rise of China will change the world, sooner or later, for better or worse. So today, Professor Thies offered us his unique view on China's future leadership in global economic governance. As he has elaborated in his talk, China is a supporter of the current liberal economic international order. I have to say that from the last question, Professor Thies' argument, it seems different from some news reports and the commentaries here in Australia, which portray China as a rule breaker all the time. So the question for you guys is to think about how we see China, how we see the rise of China. Is China a responsible great power or a rule breaker in today's world? So I think it will be a good question. It will be a hard one for you to digest after today's talk. So I think it's also the major purpose of our public lecture series, which is the Perspective for Asia, which is to offer fresh, unique, and tasty food for thought, okay, for you to think about after today's talk. So please do not blame us if you could not sleep well because of this enlightening lecture today. So I have a small present for Professor Thies on behalf of Griffith Asia Institute and also Queensland Art Gallery and Gallery of Modern Art. So please join me to help to thank Professor Thies for today's talk. Okay, thank you very much.